and what I'm going to do today is talk about the idea of transformative scholarship and transformative practice as a place where occupational science and occupational therapy can work together as allies. And why I'm talking about this is kind of because this is where I locate my own occupational science research, which focuses on social political processes and how they produce injustices for collectives, such as aging workers, aging persons with chronic disabilities, and people experiencing long-term unemployment. And I locate that in a critical transformative space within occupational science, and I see it as contributing to new directions in occupational therapy at the social level. And my specific focus will really be talking about what kinds of directions do we need to take in occupation-based scholarship in order to inform socially transformative OT. So I begin with a few starting assumptions for the talk. And my first is that OT and occupational science have transformative potential. And what I mean by that is that we have the capacity to develop innovative ways of thinking about and addressing occupational injustices at the social level with collectives. And there are growing bodies of work in both occupational therapy and occupational science that highlight the importance of contributing to social transformation. So given this, I think there's a need for dialogue about how the critical movement in occupational therapy and the critical movement in occupational science can come together to contribute towards social transformation. And then I'm going to address some key directions within occupational science that need to happen, I think, to actually contribute to occupation-based social transformation. So to begin with, I'm going to share some starting definitions, because if I've learned anything from going to different places, is that these words are defined differently in different places. So I want you to know how I'm defining these words. So for occupation, I'm defining that very broadly to encompass the everyday and the extraordinary doing that individuals and collectives engage in. And I emphasize understandings such as that proposed by Frank that highlight that occupations are actions that have transformative potential, that they can rearrange and reconstruct the world we live in, both at the individual level, so every day we do things and that changes our world, but also at a collective level. Second, I acknowledge the multiplicity of occupational therapy across contexts, or occupational therapies, and know that occupational therapy looks differently in different places. So for my definition, OT encompasses diverse practices addressing occupation at both individual and collective levels, addressing occupation both as a means and an ends of therapy, and addressing health, well-being, participation, and justice. I also view occupational science as diverse, as it looking differently in different contexts, but being characterized by efforts to conduct occupation-focused research at the individual to collective levels. So I'm going to start with the critical transformative turn in occupational therapy. So there are many calls in the occupational therapy literature to further develop forms of practice that are critical in orientation and transformative in their intent. So the development of these practices actually has a long history in many contexts, especially in spaces of the South, such as Brazil or South Africa, but has more recently grown into this diverse geographical call for occupational therapy to address issues of injustice. These kinds of OT practices take up a critical position, and they refuse to translate a social issue or cultural issue or a political issue into a technical or individual matter. They're concerned with issues of exclusion and injustice, they're politically engaged, and they seek to address occupation as a human right. authors such as Van Bruggen have called for occupational therapy to develop as a transformative discipline that contributes to social change. So in this talk, I'm using socially transformative occupational therapy as a term to encompass very long-standing forms of practice that address justice, as well as evolving approaches, and that these exist in diverse geographical spaces. What they share is what we might call an emancipatory agenda. So this idea of promoting inclusion and occupational justice through occupational therapy practice, and a commitment to addressing and transforming the so-called roots of occupational injustices. So we might think of something like homelessness or feelings of loneliness as a product of occupational justice or injustice, but the roots are located in social structures and systems and practices that lead to people being barred from the occupations they need and want to do. And there's also a commitment to working with persons facing oppression versus on them or for them. So this slide lists the key findings of a recently completed thesis by Lizette Varias, who was a student at our university in occupational science. And she conducted a critical dialogical study with 5 occupational therapists to identify as doing socially transformative OT. And so she did multiple interviews with them to try to tease out what are the key characteristics of this form of practice. And so these are listed on the slide here. So it's a form of practice that disrupts the broader systems that extend beyond individuals' control and cause injustices. It spans a continuum from individual lives to political systems. It questions the way things are, so the way policies are, or the way systems are, or the way that we practice when those things lead to occupational inequities. It builds partnerships across diverse groups and uses an occupational lens. So when it's looking at an issue like poverty, it's thinking about that from an occupational lens. And what does it mean from an occupational lens in terms of what the causes of poverty are and what the consequences of poverty are. Moreover, there's an engagement with critical theoretical frameworks to unpack issues of marginalization. And a little later, I'm going to talk about what I mean by a critical framework. So if we look at occupational science, we see a similar attention or growing attention to this idea of social transformation. And so occupational science is often, the history is often that it was generated at the University of Southern California in the late 1980s when they developed the first doctoral program named occupational science. And at that time, it was sort of a basic science of occupation that was to both develop knowledge about occupation as a concept, but also inform OT. Now, within my context, and I think within many contexts, as soon as occupational science was formed, there were debates about what was its relationship to OT. Was it the same as OT? Was it different than OT? And I think those debates have led us to a place where there is no one real definition of what occupational science is, and it can look differently in different contexts. And I've seen it look very differently in places that I've gone to in terms of both what it studies and also its relationship to OT. And so two of the other forms of occupational science beyond that kind of originally generated at USC, one is really focused on occupational justice and population health. And that came very soon after the occupational science program at USC and came out of the work of Elizabeth Townsend from Canada and Wilcox from Australia. And they really moved away from an individual idea of occupation to a more collective idea of occupation. And more recently, scholars have called for and begun to develop what I will call the critical transformative turn in occupational science. And that's where I locate my work. And so I'll talk a little bit about that particular turn. So a recent review of occupational science literature focused on this critical turn, talked about its roots in early scholarship. So we can go back to some of the original articles in occupational science by scholars such as Dickey and Frank and Townsend, and they were already using what would be a critical frame. So a frame that was looking at occupational issues as social and political issues. And this critical turn has emphasized the development of a socially responsive discipline. So similar to OT talking about its need to address social issues, we have scholars in occupational science talking about how can the science be more socially responsive? How can it actually address social issues and inform how we can change policies and systems? And this has been connected to an increasing recognition of an urgent need to engage with societal issues and their implication for occupation. So issues such as ageism, or social exclusion, or racism, and what they mean for people's occupational lives. So in a number of recent publications, I've talked about this as a potential space to bring occupational science and OT together as allies, to work together for this idea of social transformation. Because in both literatures, we're talking about this as something we want to do. So I think we're at a moment where we can move forward in building a strong alliance between occupational therapy and occupational science to generate knowledge about the social, political, and structural ways that occupational injustices are produced, and then to provide a roadmap for action, how we can go about and address those injustices. However, for OS, or occupational science, to do this, there's a need to critically reflect on how we're doing science, how we're looking at occupation, and ensure that the knowledge we generate can inform transformative practices. So what do I mean by a critical lens? Its uptake in occupational science and occupational therapy. And so when I'm using that term, I'm really using it as a sort of broad paradigmatic space that encompasses a range of critical theories that share some key assumptions. And what really marks this out is what I would call a position of tentative realism. There's an assumption that reality isn't singular, and it isn't objective, and it isn't static. Rather, realities are multiple, they're always mediated by power, and they're socially and historically constructed. So that creates the space to actually change our realities, our systems, our structures. They come to act as if they're real, we come to accept things as real, but they're social constructions. Somewhere along the way, we made some decisions, politically and socially, to construct things in particular ways, our policies and our structures and our institutions. So there's a need from this perspective to attend to power, and so critical means more than just critiquing things, but it means questioning the dominant way things are in the world, when those dominant ways, those dominant structures or policies or systems lead to injustices. So if we take a social problem such as homelessness, it starts from the perspective of how has homelessness come to be constructed? Who benefits from homelessness and who's at risk for homelessness? How do our structures and our policies produce homelessness, and how can they be changed? Rather than starting from a perspective of thinking about homelessness as an individual problem or located in individuals, it locates it at that social level. Another key aspect of a critical perspective is this idea of critical reflexivity. So it reflects on the values and the assumptions that underpin knowledge generation and practice, seeking to work against injustices. So there's constant reflection on the self, so a reflection on OT and occupational science and what some of our own biases or limitations might be to ensure that we're moving in transformative directions that open up possibilities. So when we add that transformative piece to a critical paradigm, then there's also this explicit emphasis on also acting. So it's not just understanding injustices, but figuring out how to act towards them. And so an example that you're probably all very familiar with, I would say the age-friendly city movement, is a transformative type of movement that's really looking at systems and structures and policies and how we transform them to address the social problem of exclusion in later life. So I would say that occupational science is really at a crucial moment where it can move forward with OT as an ally in transformative directions, where it has great potential to embrace this transformative potential, but it hasn't yet pushed itself in that direction fully. And so one of my concerns over the past few years has been to think about how can we continue to move in this direction. In OT, we're saying we want to, in much of the literature. In occupational science, we're saying we want to be at that social level, so how do we move ourselves in that way, and what is the role of occupational science? So I think to fully embrace this transformative potential in both occupational science and OT, we need to be critically reflexive about ourselves. And we need to radically rethink some of our assumptions about occupation and science. And others have said this as well. So Frank has called for a fundamental reassessment of the foundations of occupational science, and others have pointed to the need to challenge even our basic conceptualizations of what occupation is, and to really think about those in relationship to issues of power. So to optimally ally in transformative efforts, I think there's a need to be reflexive and expand the dominant mode of thought and orientation to science and occupation in occupational science. And to do so by reflecting on our conditions of possibility. So what do I mean by conditions of possibility? So this draws on the work of Foucault, and it's from a governmentality critical perspective. And so every discipline and every profession has a range of assumptions that kind of set the starting point for how it views the world and how it's going to act in the world. So within occupational therapy and occupational science, we have a set of assumptions about occupation. And those sets of assumptions then guide the research questions we ask and the kinds of occupations we think are important to address and the ways that we address those occupations. And so if we want to change our practice and change our scholarship, we have to think about those assumptions and which ones we want to expand or challenge or move forward, or perhaps sometimes leave behind. And these assumptions are often really taken for granted. So it's like working inside a closed box. It's difficult to see what we are studying, including occupation and other ways, because we become stuck inside that box. And the conditions in OT and occupational science work very well for some types of practice, but I would argue that they don't work very well as we try to move to social transformative directions. And so we need to think about opening up the box and expanding our conditions. And so this is my summary of a lot of literature in occupational science and occupational therapy that has started to do this critical reflection on what are our assumptions, what are the lenses that we look at occupation with, and what are the lenses that are influencing how we practice and the kind of scholarship we do. And when I first started presenting this work, I think people found it very challenging, but I think now it's actually, these critiques are actually quite common in the literature. So we're moving, I think, to be much more critical about ourselves. So one of the big critiques is that OT and occupational science are underpinned by individualistic assumptions. And what that means is basically we focused on understanding individual experiences of occupation. We have focused on this idea that individuals have control and they can choose their occupations. And that has meant that we haven't really looked a lot at the things beyond individuals that shape occupations. So things like the economy, or particular policies, or the kinds of practices common in a system like the healthcare system. We really haven't studied very much how those shape occupation for collectives and individuals. Moreover, a Western worldview, and by the West I kind of mean a Eurocentric worldview might be another frame for that, or a minority worldview, has meant that we've adopted a particular model of science, very allied with positivist assumptions. And so we tend to believe in or attempt to enact what might be value-free research, or we try to look for universals about occupation. And so this model of science has also reinforced the dichotomy of science and practice. We have some people who do science and some people who do practice, and we see those as very different kinds of actions. And I think in some sense this has led for a hesitancy, particularly on the part of occupational scientists to act. Because this sort of model of science tells us we produce knowledge and we put it out there and other people act. As well, we have tended to have an apolitical, ahistorical approach, which means that occupations are understood in the here and now and as separate from political considerations, which means that we neglect social power relations or the kinds of historical conditions that produce occupational injustices. So for example, in Canada, one of the things we've neglected that we're beginning to now think about is how our relationship with Indigenous peoples over time has created occupational injustices that we see in lower rates of schooling, higher rates of suicide, higher rates of particular mental illnesses. Those have been produced through history and through colonial power relations, and that is what needs to be addressed, rather than just working individually with people. It's also been argued that given historical and contextual features, including the dominance of English, assumptions regarding occupations that are seen as good and worthy of study and practice, and those are devalued, or those we don't see, or those that we neglect, are tied to a feminized, Anglophonic, and middle-class view of the world. We tend to study and address things in practice that are familiar to us, and in many cases, the us that is publishing the literature is located in a particular part of the world. And that has really narrowed how we understand and relate to occupation. As well, concerns have been raised regarding the incorporation of an ableist lens, in which implicitly we value able-bodiedness as normative, and we look at disability as inherently deficient, and how that becomes embedded in our scholarship. So, as with any ways of understanding, the ways of understanding in OT and OS and these dominant tendencies have led to the generation of particular types of knowledge that have worked for particular kinds of practices. But they don't work very well if we're trying to move forward in a transformative way. So a key concern is that these conditions lead to individualization, including the individualization of social problems. So we take a problem like high rates of unemployment among people with disabilities, and we tend to locate that at the level of the individual, rather than looking at that as a social problem. That our practices tend to focus on changing that individual, their capacities, their knowledge, their skills, and tend to neglect some of the societal constraints, such as ableism, that may actually be creating the barrier to engagement in occupation. As well, uncritical acceptance of these conditions of possibility, particularly in relationship to a Western worldview and an Anglophonic lens, means that we are at risk of theoretical imperialism. We're at risk of saying knowledge developed in a particular part of the world, in a particular language, is somehow universal and applicable to all parts of the world in all languages, which is a very dangerous assumption. Overall, several aspects of these conditions mean that we're constrained in moving forward in transformative directions where we need to know about power and we need to be open to diversity. So the directions that I'm going to draw upon today draw upon work that I've written about in the Journal of Occupational Science around trying to move away from an individualizing perspective and towards a transformative perspective. And so my key argument is that for OS to fully embrace being transformative and to be an ally with OT requires what I would call a radical rethinking of our sensibility, our underlying way of thinking about occupation in science. And I've used this term occupational imagination. So this idea that we need to imagine occupation in different ways, in more diverse ways, and then study it in different ways, and think of imaginative ways of changing structures and systems. In other words, we need to think outside of our box and push ourselves outside of our box. So this reconfiguration should be in directions that enable us to critically analyze social and power and political conditions that impact occupation, so then we can move forward with informed action. So I'm going to talk about 5 directions today, which are directions to think about in trying to open that box and expand our occupational imagination. So the first is embracing critical and transformative paradigms. So when I began my graduate studies, my master's, I think the first thing my supervisor said to me, and I think it was to be really helpful and make sure I wasn't too anxious and too nervous about what I was doing, was, don't worry, your research isn't going to change the world, and it's probably not even going to solve the problem you care about, right? Which was a pretty depressing thing for this young person who was coming back to her master's, obviously to change the world. And again, I don't blame my supervisor, because I think she really was trying to make it okay, because it was really hard to choose what I wanted to do in my master's thesis. And she's like, it's okay, because you're going to be doing this for the rest of your life, and this one study won't make that big of a difference. I think this message is commensurate with a particular model of science, so a positivist or even a post-positivist model of science, where we think of knowledge generation as sort of this incremental thing. So each study does a little bit, and we grow knowledge, and it's going to take a long time before that knowledge will really make a difference. And how it makes a difference isn't the role of the researcher, it's the role of people who are going to take up that knowledge. Right? So that's the paradigm I did my master's in. And then I went away and was feeling uneasy, because I thought, well, I wanted to be a researcher in an OT so I could make a difference. And so a space where I found people talking about research and practices making a difference is this critical transformative space, which talks about research and practice in very different ways. It answers questions like, what is the role of the researcher in relationship to social problems? How can research be of use in very different ways? So it conceptualizes research as a resource for social change, not as necessarily just producing knowledge, but actually producing a resource that can be used for social change. And so researchers consciously work against social structures and systems that result in oppression, and they take up a responsibility to engage with communities experiencing disruptions, experiencing marginalization, and they work towards social transformation. And so it thinks about research as radical, as unruly, disruptive, and critical. So research thinks outside the dominant modes of thought rather than supporting or contributing them. Now, obviously we can't, not all of our research can be critical and transformative and radical, because then we might never get anywhere. But I think some of our research needs to come from outside and critique what we're doing. And based on the work of Foucault, the idea is that we use research to disrupt how we think about something, if we use research to reveal the power relationships and how things are constructed, then we open up that space to think about those things differently and to act differently in relationship to those things. So within this paradigm, research is thought of as praxis, which means it's both knowledge generation and social action combined together, and it's imaginative. So a crucial role of research is to imagine new forms of organizing society through dialogue and collaboration and knowledge generation. So for occupational science, one of its roles could be opening up spaces for imagining different ways we might research, different ways we might think about, and different ways we might practice in relationship to occupation. A key aspect of this kind of research is challenging dualistic thinking. So much of what we do in the world is based on categories or dualisms. And dualisms set up categories as exclusive. So we can artificially channel our thinking that the more we have of one thing, the less we have of the other. So rather than seeing such categories as exclusive or dichotomies, critical scholarship aims to try to bring them together as tensions that need to be integrated in new ways. And within occupational science, authors have pointed to an array of dualisms which constrain our scholarship: qualitative, quantitative. We think of these two things quite separately, and very rarely do we have a dialogue across them. Individuals and environments, trying to think how we bring that work together. Or art and science. So these are dualisms that exist. I'm going to point to two key dualisms that I think are really important to rethink in OS and occupational therapy. So critical scholars have problematized how science and advocacy have been historically created as separate entities. There are people who are scientists, and there are people who are advocates. But these are separate activities in society. And they propose that research that doesn't have a commitment to advocacy or to transform social institution is actually failing in its potential. So critical scholars have also emphasized that inaction, even if it's framed as being objective and value neutral, is taken action. So if we do research within the dominant system and we don't sort of move that research towards social action, it often ends up perpetuating or supporting the dominant system, even if that's not what we intended. Similarly, the matter of the social and political commitments of occupational scientists is debated within the literature, and it's vital to reflect on how we position ourselves as occupational scientists. Do we see part of our role as advocacy in relationship to occupation? The other dualism is research and practice. So research as knowledge generation and practice as real-world application. And so thinking of this as a dualism and how we can bring research and practice together, because again, this is socially constructed for various reasons. So theory, research, and action don't have to be mutually exclusive activities, and it doesn't have to be that clinicians only do practice and researchers only do research. We can rethink ways of working together to both generate knowledge and act in the world. The third direction, it has to do with values, moral and political values underlying our research. So to be ethically responsible in social transformation, we have to address the moral and political values that guide our work. And so critical scholars would argue that all science is based upon values and involves acting morally and politically in the world. So that they would argue that the notion that science can be objective and value-free is an illusion, that there's always values guiding research. And they point to many historical examples of so-called neutral research that has actually caused a lot of damage in the world. And so they argue that it's better to be transparent and articulate your values that are guiding your research so that you can be critically reflexive on them and that the audience knows what those values are. So for example, if we're operating in values related to justice, then we need to put out what our definition of justice is and what are the values guiding our definition of justice, because those will inform our research. So adopting this kind of research challenges us to shatter our illusions of objectivity and to articulate our standpoint on what we mean by justice. What do we mean by well-being? What do we mean by inclusion? And why do we value those things? And then to allow those values to help guide our research. This also means that we would embrace different ways of evaluating the quality and the relevance of scholarship. So we might move away in critical scholarship from appraising research by its repeatability or its replicability or its internal validity. Maybe that's not what makes good research. And we can look to other kinds of criteria, such as the idea that it successfully awakens the reader's sense of obligation to transform injustice. Does it make people more aware of injustices? Does it inform people's actions? This type of research also involves embracing diversity. And when we think about those conditions of possibility, some of them were about a lack of diversity, right? So only Anglophonic, particularly from a Western viewpoint. So this idea of embracing diversity to question and step outside of our box, to engage with other ways of thinking and seeing occupation, to work to make the unfamiliar more familiar, and to question what we take as real or what we take as familiar. As one example, exploring the unfamiliar requires pushing beyond that contemporary focus on occupations that are middle class, able-bodied, and often from a female lens, and thinking about the other kinds of occupations that exist in the world that people do. So for me, the insights that can be achieved from this really became clear to me when I went to the 2017 Occupational Science Conference in Germany, because there I saw people talking about occupations and researching occupations that were very much outside what we would normally think about in the occupational therapy and occupational science. So people were looking at things like begging, sex work, survival occupations. They were studying refugees, asylum seekers, gender variant people, people living in poverty. So these aren't the sort of groups or occupations that are dominant in our literature, but people are pushing and understanding occupation in these new ways, in these different contexts, which I think will challenge some of our assumptions. Embracing diversity also involves committing to democratizing knowledge and knowing regarding occupation. It means committing to creating spaces and resources for occupational science to occur in diverse places, and not just within the places where it's now occurring. As pointed out by many Southern scholars, intercultural dialogue and translation is essential to create new possibilities for knowing and doing. And obviously this needs to be done in ways that don't perpetuate a colonial agenda, but that are actually creating spaces for looking at and studying occupation differently. So Gallego, a scholar from Brazil, has emphasized this need to have a permanent exercise of cultural sensitivity, so to be aware of our own cultural locations and how they shape what we do, and a continual political and self-awareness. Embracing diversity also involves taking up participatory and collaborative practices, which means we work with diverse participants and they help to generate the knowledge and generate the practices coming from that knowledge, as well as working with diverse disciplines which may also help us to challenge how we think and study occupation. The last direction I'm going to talk about is this idea of attending to the social-political nature of occupation. And this is really about expanding from our individualistic lens to a more social-political lens when we're thinking about what occupation is, how it's experienced, and what shapes it. And I think a lot of scholars are doing this. And so when I look at the occupational science literature, more and more I see people looking at occupation from a social and political lens. And so this involves looking at occupation as inseparable from context and social forces, attending, for example, to how occupation is shaped within and contributes to the shaping of historical conditions and social relations tied to things like race, gender, class, place, and other kinds of axes of difference. And then politicizing occupation has encompassed addressing power relations that present barriers to occupations for particular collectives and individuals. For example, looking how occupation is actually used by people in power to govern and control people who have less power. Looking at how occupation is used to create difference and exclusion within societies. And also looking at how groups use occupation to resist power relations. And so a lot of the literature, for example, on non-sanctioned occupation, literature on looking at something like drug use or graffiti or other sorts of occupations that might actually be used to resist what are dominant forms of occupation by particular groups. So I'm just going to give a few examples of research looking at occupation from this lens to hopefully help what I've been talking about become more practical or real or concrete. So studying occupation from a critical transformative lens requires both this epistemological expansion to a transformative paradigm and also methodological expansion. And it involves embracing research practices that allow us to look at occupation as situated and as political and as something that is dynamic. And so the two examples I'm going to illustrate, the first is by Natalia Riva-Cornetti and her colleagues, and they're located in Spain. And they engage with a critical occupational science perspective and epistemologies or theories from the South in a participatory study with immigrant women from Latin America who were living in Spain and doing domestic work at a time of heightened economic crisis in Spain. And their findings address the impact of structural violence on these women's occupations. So how the structures created what they called a violent situation against these women and oppressed them and moved them into very limited occupational possibilities. And it raises awareness of the occupational struggles of these women to survive, the ways in which some of their work, some of their occupation was quite oppressive, rather than our assumption that occupation leads to health and well-being, and how occupation was used by the women to resist some of the power relations in which they existed. Tied to transformative scholarship, these colleagues, or this group of scholars, worked with these women to generate priorities for action of how they might work to alter their situations. And so they continue to work with the women on how they might change their relationships with their employers. How might they change their access to healthcare services? These were the kinds of issues that the women were faced in challenging. The second example by Murphy and Shield, or Kearns, Murphy and Shield, is a very recent publication. And they looked at power relations in the context of a residential mental health facility, which might be the kind of context in which an OT might work or have clients who live in that context. And they used an ethnographic case study approach in this mental health facility and looked at the perspectives of residents and staff and family members on what was happening in the facility, how was that facility structured, and what were people doing in this facility. And through their study, they looked at the ways that power shaped occupational injustices for the residents. So they looked at the ways that the relationships between the staff and the residents, the rules of the residential facility, really limited the possibilities of residents for any form of productive occupation, any sense that they were contributing to something either within the facility or even beyond the facility. And they pointed that out as an injustice. And how could those power relationships be changed to create greater opportunities for residents to engage in productive occupation that they wanted to? And so they proposed policy and practice changes to redistribute power in that mental health facility as a way to open up occupational possibilities. So the last example is a little more extended, and this is an example from my own research. And so this is a study that I've been involved in over the last 4 years. And I've worked with colleagues, particularly Rebecca Aldridge, who at that time was in St. Louis, who's now at USC, and some colleagues from my own institution, so Suzanne Hewitt and Lilian Magalhães, Lilian's now in Brazil, but at that time she was at Western. And this study focused on long-term unemployment. And we did this in collaboration with a community organization, as well as with service providers and persons experiencing long-term unemployment. And our key objective was to look at long-term unemployment as a socially produced problem, and to look at how the occupational possibilities for people experiencing long-term unemployment were constrained by policies and structures and systems that were designed to actually get them out of long-term unemployment, but in many ways perpetuated long-term unemployment for many of the clients. And so I don't have time to fully explain the study, but I want to draw on it to provide another example of how we've used critical theoretical perspectives to try to situate occupation-focused scholarship, and some of the ways that we're trying to work with the organizations and service providers to change systems and practices. And the underlying premise of this scholarship, again based on governmentality, is that if we can begin to reveal the way that a system designed to address a social problem isn't working, so it's not resolving long-term unemployment, and we can also show its unintentional effects, so the occupational injustices that are produced in people's lives, that this begins to open up that space to think about different ways we might think about long-term unemployment, and different ways we might address the occupations of people in this situation. So, at its base, what we were trying to do is disrupt a particular way that long-term unemployment is talked about and thought about within the North American context. And I don't know if it's thought about and addressed in this way in the context of Switzerland, but certainly in North America, it's very neoliberally informed. And so this idea that in our policies and in our systems and in our employment support services, long-term unemployment is often framed as an individual problem, not a social problem. And so the problem is located in the fact that people don't have the right skills, they don't have the right education, or maybe they're not motivated, or maybe they don't want to work. And so the problem becomes an individual problem, even though we know that at a collective level, there are certain groups that are more at risk for long-term unemployment. And even though we know there are massive social changes in the labor market that also create unemployment for particular groups of people. So for example, in my context in London, Ontario, we had a massive closure of many manufacturing industries. And that meant that people who were working in those industries were left with very few options for work because they had trained for and been in that industry for a long period of time. And so the problem was the retreat of these industries and not these individual workers. So there were larger social forces at play. Combined with austerity measures that decrease state costs, these broader social, economic, or political conditions shaping unemployment are sort of obscured or downplayed And services focus on trying to fix the individual to make them more employable, and often focus on getting that individual activated in job seeking and doing education and doing training as a way to become employed. As well, these discourses and policies and services homogenize the unemployed. So we get this idea that all unemployed people are the same, and that the problem is located in the person. And they don't look at forms of discrimination faced in relationship to social characteristics like race, age, gender, or immigrant status, which means some people are much more at risk of long-term unemployment and have much more barriers to employment than other people. So we used a critical ethnographic approach, and as I said, it happened over almost a 4-year period. And we conducted the study in one Canadian city and one US city. And we wanted to really raise awareness of how these policies and practices shape both the occupational lives of people who are long-term unemployed, as well as how they shape the kinds of services that were provided to people who were long-term unemployed. And so because of that, we looked at this problem at several levels. So we started off with a policy analysis to really understand what was the policy stating. Then we looked at organizational stakeholders. So those were people who were heading up and organizing employment support services. Then we talked to and observed and interacted with people who were providing employment services. And then we collected people from data from people who experienced long-term unemployment. And that was people who self-identified. And in the end, we had people who might have been unemployed for a few months to people who had been unemployed for 15 years. So there was a quite diverse range of the length of their unemployment. And we worked with people who were long-term unemployed using several data collection methods. So we did use interviews, but we also used observations, we used time diaries, and we used occupational mapping, which is a technique where they show us where they go in the community and what they do in different places in the community, because we really wanted to understand their occupational lives at multiple levels. And then we wanted to both generate this knowledge, but then also continue to work with our collaborators to open up possibilities for thinking about this differently and practicing differently. And we're still analyzing the data. So I'm just going to give you 2 examples of things that we've actually put out there in the literature and published and worked with our partners. And so these are sort of 2 areas of insight, and then some examples of how we're trying to act towards social transformation. So a key part of what we found are contradictions created for people experiencing long-term unemployment. So contradictions between the services and their everyday lives that related to tensions and unintended consequences. And the most pervasive contradiction was this idea of being activated but stuck. So the people that we talked to were constantly activated by the system. So they were constantly looking for work. They were constantly redoing their resume. They were constantly engaged in different workshops. So they were very active, doing all of the things they were supposed to do according to the service and the system. Partly because they needed to do those things to keep their benefits, but partly because they were on this journey of trying to find work. But can you imagine doing that for 8, 9, 10 years, right? With that promise of work kind of never happening for you. So they're activated on that side, but they were stuck. They were stuck not only in long-term unemployment and not finding jobs, but they were stuck in the other occupational realms of their lives. And the service wasn't addressing those other realms. So they, for example, they were stuck in inadequate housing. They couldn't move out of their housing even if their housing wasn't meeting their needs. They were stuck in planning for the future. They were sort of in the space where they couldn't think about the future because they were constantly working in the present to try to make a better future, but it wasn't happening. They were stuck in caring for their own health, that there were things that they couldn't move forward to in caring for their health. They were stuck in things like supporting their children's education, that they couldn't think about how they would support their children's education as their children got older, which then led to this sort of perpetuation of this cycle of not completing education, being stuck in particular areas of the job market. And so in many ways, what we found was the services for these particular individuals weren't working to resolve unemployment, and they're actually creating a number of other occupational challenges in their lives. The other key finding that we've published about is around resource seeking. So in North America, and much of the policy and the media around long-term unemployment, people who are long-term unemployed tend to be constructed as dependent, as an inactive, as really doing not very much during their day. And what we were able to bring into view and able to understand through those multiple methods of data collection is how busy people were because they needed to survive in the absence of work. So without work, without stable income, most of their daily lives was spent acquiring resources, figuring out how to get food, figuring out how to get healthcare in the US, figuring out where they could get specific kinds of resources, what they needed to do and able to continue their benefits. So they were incredibly busy doing all of those things, and they were quite active. And doing those things, they had a lot of skills and knowledge to be able to do and negotiate life without work. So we have written about how that becomes both invisible in employment support services, so they're not thinking about all these other things that people need to do and want to do in order to survive. And it also becomes invisible in a lot of OT frameworks. We tend not to think about what people do in order to survive in the absence of things like income or work. In terms of informing social transformation, so what we have found through doing this work in a collaborative way is we've formed partnerships with employment service organizations, with different people in both cities who are very interested in changing systems and practices and policies. And so those partnerships have enabled us to become part of other projects. So for example, I've been a collaborator in a community-led project by an organization in my city. And that project is actually funded by our province. And what we're doing is advocating for job networks. So this idea, what's happening right now is each organization is competing against each organization for clients. And this idea of actually creating a network amongst the organizations, so they're sharing information about jobs and they're sharing clients, so that if an organization has a better relationship with an employer than another organization and your client could fit, there's more flexibility and less competition. And it's also looking at cross-sector collaboration. So how can the employment services sector actually collaborate with the health services sector? So one of the things that happened in my hometown where we did this study was at a certain point, one of the organizations had a great relationship with a mental health counseling facility. And so when clients came to them that they felt would benefit from mental health counseling, they could refer them over. And that organization was willing to take those clients on a very reduced fee basis. That stopped during the middle of the study. And there was nowhere for clients to go to get mental health counseling support. And so thinking about how do you build those kinds of relationships that are sustained by the system. Another example is one of our community collaborators took our study findings to the municipal forum. So there was a municipal forum on public transportation in my city, and one of the things that our participants told us is when there are jobs, they're on the outskirts of the city. Now, I know this may be hard to imagine because you have such public transportation systems that seem so wonderful to a Canadian, but in my context, the buses, which is our only form of public transportation, don't go to the outskirts of the city. So if you're a person who's unemployed, who doesn't have a car, you can't get to the jobs. And so in this public transportation forum, they began to develop a plan, a partnership between these businesses on the outside of the city and the public transportation system to design alternative transportation systems to get people to the jobs. It still hasn't happened. The plan's there, and we're continuing to advocate for it to happen. As another example of social transformation is now within our OT curriculum, we've brought in issues of unemployment, survival occupations, resource seeking, poverty, how it's socially politically produced into our OT curriculum, so that these are things that our students are beginning to think about, and they weren't traditionally part of our curriculum. So to conclude, my aim has been to forward a particular vision of the relationship between occupational therapy and occupational science that exists in this critical space aimed at social transformation, and within which there's this commitment on the part of occupational scientists to conduct critical transformative scholarship. And for me, within contemporary neoliberal times where we're seeing growing inequality, increasing austerity, increasing individualization of social issues, I think it's very crucial at this time that we commit to moving our transformative agenda forward. And I think that working together as allies, challenging some of those dichotomies like practice and theory and applied and basic, we can work together to expand conditions of possibility in ways that promote human flourishing for a greater diversity of people through occupation. Thank you.